Hey guys, and welcome to our next set of biology notes. Today is going to be all about the skeletal system. So the series of joints and bones in your body that not only help to protect all your internal organs, give them structure, but also give you the ability to stand up and walk around. So with that, let's get into the notes. All right. The skeletal system. So we're going to be basically going over some of the basic functions of our bones, some of the major groups of bones that we have in our body and what they do, what the inside part of the bone does, and finally, what are all the different types of joints in our body and where can we find them. So the skeletal system, we can actually split into kind of two different major sections. We have the axial skeleton, which is basically just all the stuff right down the center of your body. So your skull, your spine, your ribs, and your sternum right here on the front, all of that makes up the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton, or where your appendages are, is all the bones that make up your arms and your legs and where they attach to that axial skeleton. So obviously we have all of our arm bones and all of our leg bones. But then we also have what's called the pectoral girdle, which is your collarbone and shoulder blade right up here on both sides. And then we also have what's called the pelvic girdle, which is just your pelvis, your hip bones, right down here at the base of your body, the base of your spine. So there are 6 major functions of bones in our body. Most of them you've probably heard about before, but some of them you may not have. So the first one is that bones provide the shape, the support, and the framework of the body. So the reason why we're able to have the shape that we do and why we look the way we do is because of the bones on the inside. These are what our organs and skin and stuff like that attaches to and gets stretched over. Bones also provide protection for our internal organs. So our organs, kidney and liver and stomach and stuff like that, they're all very squishy and fairly easy to damage. So we have these bones, like the rib cage right up here, that covers up and helps to protect them. So the bones are really hard and really difficult to break. It takes a lot of force in order to break a bone. And so they provide some protection from these internal organs getting damaged by the outside world. Bones are where our muscles are attached to. So our muscles are what allow us to move and engage in motion, obviously. But the way that they do that is by basically pulling around our bones. And so in order to do that, the muscles have to be attached to the bones so that when the muscles contract, they're actually moving that bone from one area into the other. And that's what gives you your motion. Bones are really, really important for making blood cells. So the fancy anatomy term for this is hematopoiesis, which just means forming blood cells in your bone marrow. We're going to talk about bone marrow in a little bit, but this is where your actual blood cells, so your white blood cells and your red blood cells, are made inside of your bones. That is where your blood cells come from. And finally, thanks to the fact that bones are articulated, meaning that they have joints that they can move around, that is the other thing that makes movement possible. So not only are the muscles pulling the bones one way or the other, but the reason that the bones are able to move over one another is due to these joints, these kind of movable areas where the bones connect. I'll talk about joints a lot at the end of our presentation today. So we have 4 major types of bones that exist in our body. The first type is called long bones. These are, just like you would expect, bones that are very, very long and usually somewhat skinny. So it's longer than it is wide. They have growth plates at either end that allow them to grow longer over the course of your life. Obviously, you don't stay the same size from 1-year-old to 18-year-old. The reason that you grow is because your bones are growing. Long bones have a hard outer surface of something called compact bone. So compact bone is kind of like the armor of the bone. This is what gives it its toughness and its strength. And then inside of long bones is this much more spongy bone, so that has a ton of little holes all going through it, that contains the bone marrow. So long bones, due to the fact that they are nice and long, they're some of the biggest bones in your body, these contain a lot of bone marrow and produce a lot of the blood cells that your body uses. Most of your bones contain a little bit of blood marrow in them, but especially long bones contain a lot. So what are some of the different types of long bones that you might have in your body? Your humerus is one, so that's the bone for your arm right up here between your shoulder and your elbow. It's your humerus. And your tibia is another good one. That's one of the bones in your leg. And then the femur, which is the bone between, so up here would be your hip, and down here would be your knee. Femur is also a long bone. So, like I mentioned, all very long, but nice and skinny, and contain very, very tough bones, and contain a lot of bone marrow inside of them. The second type of bone is the short bones. So these are very squat, kind of squarish looking bones. And so these bones provide a lot of support and stability for different areas, and the bones on their own don't really move a whole lot. Instead, they're usually grouped with lots and lots of short bones together, and those short bones kind of moving around one another is what allows for movement in certain areas. But our short bones are kind of just things like short and squat bones. So we tend to have lots of little short bones in particular areas, especially in your wrist, so your carpals right here. There's a lot of little short bones all in there. And same thing with your tarsals or your ankles. So your carpal is your wrist, your tarsal is your ankle. And again, as you can see down here, lots and lots of little bones. So like I said, on their own, these little bones, these short bones, don't move a whole lot, but the reason why we're able to get pretty good rotation of movement in our wrists and ankles is because these bones kind of move over and glide around one another. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the joints later on. Our third type of bone is the flat bone. These guys are kind of like the armor plating of our body. So just like the name suggests, is very flat. And because of that, it's mostly this compact bone. So it is very strong. We use these as kind of armor plates to protect different areas of our body. So they do a lot of protection, and also tend to be where a lot of muscles are attached to. But really, the flatness, the strength, and the protection are kind of the major things to focus on with our flat bones. So just like the name suggests, these bones are pretty flat. They include things like your ribs and your sternum right here. So lots of these little thin kind of flat ribs. And then your sternum is your breastbone right in the middle. Your cranium, where you have to have the most important protection of your brain, is a very dense flat bone. And also your scapula, or also known as your shoulder blade, right back here, is another flat bone. Like I said, name kind of gives it away. All these guys are pretty flat, don't have tons of marrow inside them, and are used mostly for protection of different important areas. So we have long, we have short, we have flat bones. And now our fourth type is basically kind of the leftover bones that don't really fit into a good category. So we call them irregular bones, bone type number 4. So these guys don't really have a shape similar to the other bones. They're not long and skinny, they're not flat and tough. They come in kind of weird shapes and sizes. So they have a thin layer of compact bones, so they're not very good at protection, but they have a lot of cancellous bones. We can also get a lot of bone marrow in these irregular bones as well. So mostly these guys make up your spine, so they protect your spinal cord and other nervous tissue, and serve as another point for skeletal muscles, especially muscles in your back, to attach to. So some of these weird looking irregular bones include your bones of your spine or your vertebrae. So all those little bumps going all the way up and down your spine make up your vertebrae. So your spinal cord goes through here, and then all this stuff around it is used for protection. You have the sacrum, which is right at the very bottom of your spine, where your spine meets your hip. So your coccyx down here is your tailbone. So if you ever like fallen or sat down really hard unexpectedly, you might have you bruised your tailbone, which is not a fun experience. But then you have this big fused bone called the sacrum up here as well. Another one in your jaw, your mandible, so your bottom jaw right here. Again, doesn't really look like any of the other bones in your body. It has this kind of U shape where it connects to your top jaw back here, and then the bottom opens and closes in order to chew and eat stuff. So that's why these are irregular bones. They don't really fit in with any of the other bone types. So scientists decided just to kind of lump them together under this irregular bone category. So our 4 major types of bones are long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. All right, up next we're going to talk about the specific names of some of the important bones in your appendicular skeleton. So your shoulders, your waist, and the bones of your arms and your legs. So up top we have the clavicle, also called the collarbone. That's like right here. That connects to your scapula, or your shoulder blade, which is one of those big flat bones that we talked about earlier. And that's what makes up what's called your pectoral girdle, or the area where your arm gets attached to that axial skeleton, that center skeleton of your body. It's attached due to the collarbone and the shoulder bone back here. So we have our clavicle and our scapula. If we move down into the arm, we have the humerus right here. So that's between your shoulder and your elbow. And your humerus attaches to 2 smaller bones in your forearm. So the ulna and the radius are what make up your smaller arm. You can always find your radius because this is the one that is connected by your thumb So right here on this arm would be the radius, because it's the one that connects up to my thumb. And then the ulna is what connects to your pinky finger. So radius on the thumb side, ulna on the pinky side. You then have the carpals right here that go into your wrist that we talked about earlier. Those are those little short bones. The metacarpals are what make up the kind of base of your hand. So like your palm right here is your metacarpals. And then the phalanges are your fingers. So the carpals are your wrist. Metacarpals are your palm. And the phalanges are your fingers. So humerus in your arm, ulna and radius on your forearm, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges up here. So obviously that's the same for both sides of your body, both arms, but also remember this one bone, two bone, little bone structure, because we actually find the same thing in our legs. So let's go there, Matt. But remember, one bone, two bone, little bones. So in your legs, for your pelvic girdle, you just have your hip bones right here. So it's actually basically two different bones that on one side are fused with the sacrum. So your sacrum is right here, that irregular bone. And then on the front, they're attached with this little piece of cartilage, which is what gives you a tiny little bit of movement in your hip. We then have your upper leg bone is your femur. So this is the strongest bone and the largest bone in your body. Like I said, it connects your hip with your knee. The patella is your kneecap. So it's this kind of little floating bone right here. And then the tibia is the main bone in the bottom half of your leg between your knee and your ankles. And that's going to be on the inside part of your leg, so closest to the middle of your body. The fibula is a very, very small and thin bone that basically just kind of supports the tibia. And it is going to be on the outside part of your leg. So the part closest to the outside of your body, the outside edge. And then once again, we have, instead of carpals, we have tarsals in the foot. Instead of metacarpals, we have metatarsals as the main part of our foot. And then, just like with our finger bones, our toe bones are also called phalanges. So your tarsals are basically your ankle. Your metatarsals are your foot. And the phalanges are your toes. So again, notice we have the same basic setup as we did in our arm. We have one bone, two bones, and then some little bones. So our arm and our leg are set up in the same kind of basic orientation. One bone, two bones, lots of little bones, one bone, two bones, lots of little bones. So those are the arms of the bones of your leg, and man, I'm all confused. The bones of your arm and your leg. So the bones themselves, we'll use a long bone as an example, is made of a couple different parts. The outside part of the bone, like I mentioned earlier, is the compact bone. So that's what you see when you're looking at a bone that hasn't been cut open or anything. It covers the outside, and that's the very hard, dense bone that makes bones strong and gives them their strength and their protective abilities. The next, a little bit more inside part of the bone is called spongy bone, which is, like you can see, kind of right here and right here and right here. We got some spongy bone. So this is sort of like honeycomb. It's lots of little pockets inside of these bones. And then some bones have this kind of cavity in the middle, especially these long bones, have this cavity right here where bone marrow is stored. And so bone marrow is what's used to make our blood cells. So tough, compact bone, kind of going around the outside. Spongy bone, right underneath that. And then this bone marrow cavity for some bones, not all of them, some bones are just compact bone and spongy bone, but some bones, especially long bones, since they have the space for it, have this extra cavity right in the middle of the bone here where we can store that bone marrow. So there are actually two different types of bone marrow in human bodies. The blood cells that we've been talking about all this time, the hematopoiesis, making the blood cells, is what happens in the red marrow of the bones. So red blood cells, which is where the red marrow gets its name from, white blood cells, and platelets all are made in the red marrow of our cells, of our bones. So the amount of red marrow that you actually have changes in your lifetime. In infants, pretty much all of our bones have red marrow on the inside. So we're constantly pumping out new blood cells as infants. As we get older and grow into our more mature adult bones, some of our long bones that we've been talking about, especially in our arms and legs, instead of being filled with red marrow, that changes to yellow marrow. So yellow marrow is for fat storage. So we can actually use our bone marrow inside of our long bones, especially, to store some of the fat that our body produces and that we hold on to for later energy production. Remember, all the way back at the beginning of the semester, we were talking about lipids and how lipids are fats and our body uses them for long-term energy storage. This is one of the areas where it stores that fat, is in the bone marrow. We still have red marrow that's making our blood cells kind of in the middle part of our skeleton here, because obviously we need to keep making blood cells in order to survive. So in adults, the red marrow is in the spongy bone of these kind of axial skeleton bones. So skull, ribs, spine, and the two girdles, the pectoral and the pelvic girdle. And then yellow marrow is what goes into our arms and our legs. So the most important things to remember about these is that red marrow does the blood cells and yellow marrow stores the fat. The last thing that we're going to talk about in terms of the skeletal system is our joints. So a joint is a place where two or more bones connect. So where bones come together, we're going to have a joint. So how they connect and how they become attached to one another determines what kind of movement is going to be allowed at that joint. So we're going to go through all the major types of joints in our body one by one and kind of talk about how do they move and what types of bones, what types of joints are specific joints located at. And so that's the thing that you should know for these joints as well. What's the name of the joint? What kind of movement do we get at that joint? And where on your body can you find that joint? So, like I said, anywhere that bones connect is a type of joint. That doesn't necessarily mean that all types of joints move a whole lot. So our first two types of joints that we're going to talk about are the immovable joint and the slightly movable joint. So in an immovable joint, we have no movement between the bones. So this usually happens, this is especially prevalent in our skull, because when you're first born as a baby, your skull is actually 8 separate bones. This is what allows the baby's head to be squeezed out of the mom during the birth process, because those bones are able to kind of compress and squeeze a little bit. But then once the baby's out, these bones start hardening up and fusing with one another. And so because these bones are totally fused together, they're still different bones, so that's what makes it a joint, but we call it an immovable joint. These bones are not supposed to move after the first year or so of life. At that point, they should be completely fused and protecting the skull together. Our next joint, our slightly movable joint, just like you said, we have a tiny bit of movement, a little bit of movement between the bones. So we find this in our hip bone, right at sort of the base of our hip here. This is what allows us to kind of stretch that hip bone when we're walking or when we're moving. It's also especially important in women who are giving birth, because the slightly movable joint is what allows these hip bones to spread apart a tiny bit and allow a little more space for the baby to move through. And so immovable joints in our skull are just bones that have fused together and don't allow any movement. Slightly movable joint in our hips and allows for a tiny bit of movement between the two bones. All right. All of the other joints in our body allow for a pretty good to a very wide range of movement. So the first one that we're going to talk about in these joints, the ball and socket joint, is probably what allows for the most amount of movement in our body. Movement in all directions. So we find these guys in our hips, where the femur connects to the hip is a ball and socket joint. That's what allows you to kind of move your leg and twist it all around. And we also have a ball and socket joint in our shoulder. So the reason why we're able to make these big windmills or twist our arms back and forth is due to the ball and socket joint. All forms of directional movement are allowed by this joint. Pivot joints are ones that allow for twisting and rotation. And probably the biggest pivot joint that we have is between the two top bones of our spine right here. So this would be our skull up here, and this is the rest of our spine down here. And so these joints is what allows your head to turn from side to side like this. So this is a rotational joint. It allows us to rotate our head back and forth. Gliding joints, our next set of joints we're going to talk about. These are what allow for this gliding movement of bones kind of over other bones. And so these are especially prevalent in our carpals of our wrists. So I have these gliding joints here that allow that wrist movement of the bones gliding over one another. And we can also have gliding joints, obviously, and the tarsals of our ankle. And so our ankle is the same thing, right? You can kind of make circles with your feet at the end of your leg. And so this gliding joint in your ankle bones is what allows you to do that. Finally, probably the most common type of joint that we have in our body is the hinge joint. So this is what allows movement in just one single plane, so like up and down, essentially, not a lot of side to side turning. And we have hinge joints all over our body. So there's one between the humerus and the radius and ulna. So for those of you who were paying attention earlier when we were talking about the names, you know that this is the arm, meaning that this right here is our elbow. And so, because if you think about it from your elbow, right, you can go up and down. You can't really turn your arm without turning this part this way or that way. It just goes up and down from the elbow. You have hinge joints in your knee is probably the other biggest type of hinge joint that you have. So again, your leg can kind of swing out and move back, but you can't really twist it below your knee one way or the other. You also have hinge joints in your fingers and your toes. Again, especially the knuckles up here, it's just, is it out or in, out or in? And then you also have a hinge joint in your mandible right here. So this one is a little bit more flexible. You can kind of move your mouth side to side a little bit, but mostly it's good for up and down, right? So it's moving around the joint right here and going out and in this single plane of movement. So, quick joint review. Ball and socket joint, lots of movement in your shoulder and your hip. Pivot joint allows for rotations, especially between your skull and your spine right here. Gliding joints are in your ankles and your wrists, and they are what allow for this kind of gliding overall motion. And hinge joints are all over your body, especially in your elbow and your knee, and they're what allow for this single plane motion, this single back and forth motion. And that is everything that you should know about the skeletal system. So for the assignment for the skeletal system, the homework that you guys are going to have, it should be pretty simple. It goes pretty closely along with the notes that we were just looking at. So let's take a quick look at what the homework looks like. So here's the worksheet that you guys are going to be doing. For the first part of it, I just want you to list out those 5 functions of bones that we talked about earlier. Things like protection and muscle attachment and blood cell formation, all that stuff. So make sure you get your 5 functions of bones. For part 2, we have the types of bones. And so remember, we had the 4 types. And so for each one of the long bones, the short bones, the flat bones, and the irregular bones, you need to write down its name. What is some of the major structure? What are some of the major functions of the bone? And also, what are some examples of this bone? Then finally, the third part is the types of joints. And so what are the names of the 6 different joints that we talked about? What kind of movement do they allow? Is it lots of movement, one type of movement, or very restricted movement? And where are some places in the human body that you can find these types of joints? So hopefully that should be everything you need to know about the skeletal system and how to answer the questions on the handout. Remember, as always, please reach out to me if you have any questions at all. You can send me a text message, email me, or post a question on the Google Classroom, and I'll do my best to respond to your question as soon as I see it. You can also come to one of our Zoom office hours that I have set up and ask your questions to me kind of person on person. In order to turn in the homework, remember, you can upload it to the Google site. You can take a picture and write down your answers on a separate sheet of paper and email that picture to me or text that picture to me. All right. Hopefully, all that was pretty clear and straightforward. Again, please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you for our next set of notes later on.